What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the latest remake of one of the classic Universal horror monsters, and that film is called Wolfman. Directed by Leigh Whannel, who wrote this film alongside Corbett Tuck, this film stars people like Christopher Abbot, Garner, Matilda, Firth, and many more. And before we get too far into this video, I'd like to say a big thanks to all of you guys for taking the time out of your day to listen to my thoughts on a movie. And if you're new to the channel and you like early reviews for movies like this one, as well as things like retrospective reviews, live streams, and the occasional vlog, then you're in the right place, and I'd like to ask you to consider subscribing. And if you're a returning viewer, well, thank you so much for taking the time to come back and listen to me talk about another movie. And today we're going to be talking about Wolfman, which is the latest remake of a classic Universal horror monster. Now, if you guys have been following this channel, you know I'm a huge fan of the Universal horror monsters, and as a kid, I used to love watching all the old school movies. I've always been really pulled into that world, and Wolfman is one of my favorite characters in the mix. I have covered the original film from 1941, of course starring Lon Chaney Jr. as one of the most iconic movie monsters of all time, as well as the 2012 remake starring Benicio del Toro, that despite the fact that it's not the greatest on a narrative level, I honestly love that film. I think it's a very worthy remake in a lot of ways. It does its own thing while also honoring the original film in a lot of ways, and I think it has some of the best practical effects that were done by Rick Baker in that film. I think the aesthetic of the Wolfman in that film is as good as it can possibly get. So with all that said, when I heard there was a new Wolfman film coming from director Leigh Whannel, I was really excited. He's somebody I've been a big fan of since the first Saw movie, and back about 5 years ago now, he directed Invisible Man, which was of course another remake. Now, both this film and the Invisible Man remake that he did are not really concerned with trying to be remakes of the original source material, but instead taking the base premise, the concept of the monster that is at the center of those movies, and telling a new story, new characters, new setting, new time, place, and it isn't really focused on trying to be a remake of the exact events and the exact characters of those original films. And on one hand, I really enjoy that. I think if you're gonna make a remake, make it worthwhile, make it something that's different, make it something that has its own identity. So I really appreciate the fact that his approach has been not to remake what was already been done, and in a lot of ways has already been remade. In the case of a lot of these characters like Invisible Man, Dracula, Wolfman, they've been in so many films, in sequels of themselves, remakes, and all that kind of stuff. So I appreciate the approach to do something a little bit different. Now, I went into this film a little bit skeptical because the first thing that I saw from this film was some footage that released from Halloween Horror Nights of a quick little promotional thing they had there of somebody in a costume for Wolfman. And the look wasn't really my favorite, but of course it was a Halloween Horror Nights costume. It didn't look as good as I knew it would look in the movie, so I went into it a little skeptical, but also kind of like, all right, let me see what this movie does in and of itself, because Wolfman is one of my favorite characters in the mythology of horror monsters. With all that said, before we get into my general opinion on the film, let's get into what this film is all about, and then we'll get into my thoughts. Wolfman focuses on a family. You have people like Christopher Abbot here as the dad, who's playing Blake. You have Julia Garner, the wife and mother here, who is the character of Charlotte, and their daughter, Matilda Firth, who is the character of Ginger. Right after Blake unfortunately hears about the passing of his father, he decides to go back to a cabin in the woods that he's used to spend a lot of time with his dad in Oregon, to go to collect his things and kind of deal with the stuff after his father has passed. That's when he decides, hey, listen, our family isn't as close as much. There's a bit of a discourse between him and his wife. The wife isn't really connected to the daughter as much as she used to be because she's working a ton. Let's take this quick family trip. It's going to be a sad experience, but let's go out into the mountains together in Oregon, spend some time together, separate ourselves from the city, get ourselves right, and also deal with what I have to deal with my father's belongings. And of course, as you would come to expect, they end up going up there to discover that there is a Wolfman of sorts that eventually ends up infecting Christopher Abbott's character as he slowly starts to become a new Wolfman throughout the course of the film. And now his wife and daughter must do what they can to try to survive while also trying to appeal to the human side of him that is still in there. And that is the base premise of Wolfman. And what I can start this off by saying is I think this is a very well shot film. There's some great moments of tension and some cool moments of action. I thought a lot of the practical effects in the film were really well done, which was one of the things I was hoping for the most. There's a lot of great blood, guts, and gore in the film, some moments that will definitely get the reactions from the audience in terms of body horror. And I think overall, when it comes down to the production of the film, it's very well made. The film looks good, it sounds good, it's well performed. The blood and guts and gore element of it is really good, and the scenery is beautiful. A lot of the mountain play, a lot of the forest play as well that's in here. I really enjoyed the look of the film and the locations they use used over the course of the film. It definitely heightened the experience, making it a far more tangible film in terms of practical locations and all that thing. It really added to the atmosphere of the film. With all that said, I gotta be honest in saying that I was a little bit torn on this film leaving the movie, because I felt that the story kind of was just okay. I never really found myself overly connected to the characters as the movie was playing out, and I found the story in a lot of ways to be very samey. Most of it takes place in one location, and when it comes down to things like chamber pieces that kind of lock our characters into one place, or just a couple of buildings that are right next to one another, you kind of have to heighten the experience with narrative and with dialogue, and this isn't really a film that did that. This was a film that by the time we got to the end, anticlimactic is the main word that pops up in my mind. There are some great moments here with the Wolfman element of it. There are some great moments of body horror. There's some great moments of tension. And there are some great moments of dialogue and performance between certain characters, most notably between the father and daughter in this situation, which I really enjoyed. But as the movie was playing out, it's one of those movies that got to the end of the film and it felt like not an abundance had really happened. You know, when you sit in a movie theater and you're getting to the very end, you can feel it's the moments that are coming to the end of the film, and you're just kind of thinking to myself, damn, I feel like we got here pretty fast, and I don't feel like enough really happened for this to feel like the climax, for this to feel like the big end. And that's ultimately how I felt about Wolfman. I enjoyed my experience. I was entertained. I was never bored while watching it. By no means do I think this is a bad film, and I think there's definitely a fun element to be had here, but I don't think this film really lives up to the legacy of previous Wolfman films, and with it kind of giving itself its own identity in terms of its story and its characters and even the aesthetic of the Wolfman in this film, you would hope that it would have done more on a narrative level to really make it stand out. But ultimately for me, it felt like a very conventional, very predictable, straightforward horror film that you've seen so many times with the Wolfman name attached. And when it comes down to the Wolfman element, I don't think the design of the Wolfman in the film is all that great. It leans more into man than it does wolf. And on one hand, I appreciate the approach to not necessarily make him look like Lon Chaney Jr. in the original film, or the various versions that have come out after that, or things like Benicio del Toro's, which of course is very much inspired by the original Lon Chaney look. In the case of this film, it felt like it was going for a little bit more of a man who has wolf-like looks to him, like it looks more like a disease that's eating at him. And I thought that was interesting. It maybe approaches it in a little bit more of a realistic approach and kind of removes a little bit more of the fantastical side of things. I also thought there were some cool elements to this film that bring something new to the table, like the fact that we get to see in the Wolfman's mind how his family starts to kind of look and sound to him as his mind starts to become more wolf. He's struggling to understand them, and they're struggling to understand him, and there's a disconnect that starts to happen there. And I thought that was an interesting element of this film, kind of giving us a peek behind his eyes and how he gets to kind of see the world now as Wolfman, and how it's kind of starting to deteriorate his mind and ruin that man side of him. It's starting to take away the humanity within him. I thought that was really interesting. So there are some cool elements here, but this is a movie that by the time the movie was over, I just found myself thinking the story wasn't all there. It just felt like a very generic, predictable horror film that if it didn't have the Wolfman title attached to it, I don't think this is a film that many people would see, nor do I think it's a film that a lot of people would ever really think is all that good. I think it just feels like in a lot of ways just a pretty straightforward horror film that has a very popular IP name attached to it. And that's disappointing, right? I went into this really hyped. I'm a huge fan of Wolfman, and I was looking forward to a really fun, rich story. But you just don't get that. One thing I struggled with a lot in this film is Julia Garner, who plays the mother and the wife here. Now, we learned pretty early on that there is a bit of a disconnect between her and her husband, Blake, and she's been working so much that she's almost kind of lost that ability to really even connect with their daughter, and it's the husband who's able to connect with the daughter far more. I really enjoyed that father-daughter element of the film. But because she's meant to kind of be this character who is kind of disconnected, and now she's forced into a situation where she has to protect her daughter and also try to kind of appeal to the humanity of her husband, throughout the course of the film, there is a lot of sequences where I feel like the emotional weight is kind of weighing on Julia Garner's shoulders, and I never really felt like she really took it there. There is an element of her performance that feels very suppressed and very stoic. It doesn't really feel like she's a character that's able to emote much. There's moments where she should be terrified that she just feels like she's kind of like a plank. She's just kind of a blank surface. She's not really giving much on a performance level. And while she does bring something to this film in terms of her performance at times, she's by no means terrible in this film, I thought there was something lacking with her character, and it could be a direction thing. It could have been how she was directed. It could have been what was on the page in terms of her character. But watching her character play out, she was kind of frustrating at times because there was an emotional disconnect between not only her and the characters within the film, but it just felt like within herself in general. And it kind of made it tough for us as an audience to really connect with her, because it felt like there was an emotional disconnect between her and us as well. It felt like we weren't able to really go on that journey with her. And once she kind of becomes the main focal point, the main person that you really kind of need to root for as her husband is starting to turn into this Wolfman, it just didn't do enough on a script level or on a screenplay level for me to ever really find myself fully committing to her. I was more kind of really appreciating where the film was going in general and just kind of watching it out of a curiosity perspective, less so because I was kind of like rooting for the characters or finding myself really gripped by the narrative, which is disappointing. I think, as you can tell, there's a divide within me when it comes down to this film, because there are elements I liked on a filmmaking level, but, you know, the thing I think that is going to make people think about a movie like this for long periods of time, you know, months and years down the line, is the story. And I just don't think the story here really stands up to the same level of previous Wolfman movies. Even some of the goofier films that maybe are a little bit more, you know, tongue-in-cheek and know what they are. I think that this film definitely has its own identity in terms of the way that they approach this character turning into the Wolfman. It's definitely more of a body horror, kind of slow progression of him turning into it, rather than having this one big transformation scene where he's turning into this monster and now the rest of the movie is kind of trying to avoid this monster. It's him slowly becoming this monster. And while I do appreciate that, it just left a lot of this movie kind of feeling very samey, and ultimately left me feeling a little bit bored with sections of the film, even if I was still entertained. I enjoyed it. I don't think it was a bad movie. I'd probably give it a 3 out of 5, even though I don't review things here with a score typically, because I typically change my scores. But if I had to kind of give it a score, I would say somewhere in like 3 out of 5 range is probably the safest place I can put it, where it's not a bad movie, but it's by no means anything that I think is really great. And I think it's unfortunate when you have a character like Wolfman that's being remade. I think that they were trying to do something different here, but it just didn't land for me. So that's going to be my thoughts on Wolfman, and I look forward to hearing what people have to say about it. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Are you planning on checking it out? And most importantly, I definitely want to know, what is your favorite werewolf film or your favorite Wolfman film? Whatever the case may be, leave it in all comments down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.